So we're in that new section of notes for Aristotle. And I wanted to start this morning by reading Hebrews 11:1 that gives a great definition of faith. And this is not an unfamiliar verse to us, but it explains faith to us. Now, a lot of times when you're engaging with someone who is an unbeliever, they will define faith for you in a way that is inaccurate and untrue. They'll say something like, well, if you ask them, what is faith? Well, what do you think faith means? They say, well, it means something that's apart from reason, or it means something that reason has no part of it, or they'll say it's believing in something without evidence, or something like that. So we have to say, okay, well, I don't accept that definition of faith. I don't acknowledge that as what faith is. In fact, that's not what faith is. However, Hebrews 11:1 gives us a pretty interesting definition of faith, and it also ties in with our talk on empiricism, which empiricism is, if you remember, everything is all truth, all knowledge comes through observation. And we said, well, you can't observe everything, and not everything can be observed. In fact, the standard for truth in empiricism, the statement, all knowledge comes through observation, that can't be observed, so it doesn't even meet its own standard. But Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And so and sometimes it even says in different translations, the evidence of things not seen. So it's based on a sure conviction, a hope in the future on things that have not been seen, things that have not been experienced through the senses. And so we're going to look at an ancient empiricist, Aristotle, one of the greatest Western philosophers after probably Plato, and they lived in the same time period. In fact, Aristotle was the student of Plato. He was too young to have known Socrates, but he was the greatest student of Plato. And they say that no student had a greater teacher and no teacher had a greater student. And so, but he diverges pretty significantly from the worldview of Plato, because Plato gets to his rationalism, basing everything supposedly on reason, gets him to these places where he becomes irrational. He says these things that just make no sense, have no provability, that have serious internal problems. And Aristotle recognizes those and can't figure those out. The most important areas of Plato's philosophy are inconsistent. And so he decides to go another direction. He doesn't abandon reason, but he says we should have a tool of analysis, which would be reason, but we also need to experience things with our senses, and then kind of building from the ground up, put together the general theory about the world, so by observing things in the world. So kind of an interesting direction that he goes there. Immanuel Kant, who's a later philosopher, talks about Aristotle and Plato, Aristotle and Plato and their contribution. And he says, with reference to the origin of pure concepts of reason, and whether they are derived from experience or have their origin independent of experience in reason. So that's basically the two points. Does our reason come from what we observe and then we kind of put it together in our minds? Or is it something that's independent of our experience that evaluates everything that we observe? So Kant goes on to say, Aristotle may be considered the head of the empiricists, saying you have all knowledge comes through observation. Plato, the head of the noologist or the rationalist, that all truth comes from reason before and above and independent of experience. And so, as I said, Aristotle's that student of Plato, but recognizes the serious problems in Plato's rationalism and leads him to reject rationalism. Now, he does that to go into empiricism, which is also wrong and also self-defeating. as we saw a little bit last week, and we'll see a little bit more this week as well. And so it is interesting that two of the major philosophers, Western philosophers, who are probably two of the greatest contributors to Western philosophy, lived at the same time and interacted with and knew each other and created pretty much two streams of philosophy that impact the Western world and the world in general, even to this day. And a lot of people borrow from a little bit of each of these things. And a lot of times when you're engaging with someone and talking about things, they'll have bits and pieces of philosophies. Rarely do you have someone who says, I'm a rationalist, and they bring in consistently all of rationalistic philosophy, or I'm an empiricist. You'll have people talking about you need to use reason. You'll have people saying, well, I believe in empirical science or this and that, and I believe it for these empirical reasons. And then they'll have elements of, all kinds of different things, that it's not uncommon for people like that to say, but by the way, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And so they'll have an element of mysticism. And then the kind of interesting thing about our world is we live in a world of kind of intellectual freedom where we're able to choose different things. There are different worldviews available to us, and especially with the internet, you can get on and be a part of identify with any type of community. So people can really, that element of intellectual choice, people can pick and choose from all kinds of philosophies and worldviews, and rarely do they just pick to one and stick with it consistently. So usually it's not that deep and sophisticated a commitment to any particular worldview is what you'll find with a lot of unbelievers that you'll engage with. Something interesting, though, that I wrote down in my notes here before we get on and talking about Aristotle and his contribution, and then also kind of the issues with the philosophy of empiricism, is I just learned about something this week in the sciences. This is an issue that arose in the social sciences, which would be like psychology, political science, kind of economics. Economics has become more of a hard science in some ways. But psychology, sociology, anthropology, those areas. But also in medical science, medical studies, marketing and economics, all kinds of different areas of even hard sciences has run into this area, this crisis called the Replication Crisis. And so remember that we talked about that the kind of three major proponents of the scientific method are that something has to be observable, testable, and repeatable. Okay? That third one, repeatability, is a hugely important thing for establishing the basis of anything in empirical science using a scientific method. And when I say empirical science there, I'm not talking about the philosophy, I'm just talking about the method, which can yield us some really good results. That's a good thing that's contributed a lot to the world if it's used as a tool instead of an authority. But the replication crisis, and lots of scientists, you can actually just look up, the Wikipedia page has a lot of information about this and has a lot of links that go to scientific journals and things like that. And they had surveys taken of hundreds of scientists that asked them, is there a replication crisis? And most of them said yes. And the replication crisis is this. When a study is done, it has a methodology where you have dependent and independent variables, meaning here's the things that in our study that we're saying stay the same. Here's the thing that we're saying if you enter it in, it will change the result. That's an independent variable. And then they say, if it's a good study, they'll say, here's our method of how we got to the results we got to. Here's what we think our potential weaknesses might be. And they remain open to correction. They say, okay, here's the results we got. And they leave themselves, and here's what we think those results suggest. And they leave themselves open to further corrections. And that is what science is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be an ideology. It's supposed to be a self-correcting learning about the world and figuring things out and coming to conclusions by testing them over and over again. But the problem with that, and even though that is good and we're able to do that and the world works in a generally orderly and stable way because God created it that way, but we also have elements of change and chaos and things like that, but that is limited. We have a general expectation of things to operate in a stable and orderly way in our environment. However, the replication crisis is that scientists have acknowledged in all these different areas of studies that if their studies were done again, like somebody went over, applied the same methodology, did everything in the study as much as they could the same exact way, that they couldn't duplicate the results. They couldn't get the same results. And this is in something like 70% of studies. And so what that means, and studies are very valuable. That doesn't mean even the studies that can't be replicated didn't contribute something to the field or the knowledge of science or some useful things. But it means that there are limits. And it means that key element of repeatability is often missing. And that doesn't mean that we say, okay, well, all studies are worthless and, science is worthless because you can't have that repeatability. Not at all. But it does bring in the element, or it should bring in the element of that there are missing pieces and problems that when people say studies show or this or that it's not all it's cracked up to be all the time. And there are problems and missing pieces of information and things that we don't know of exactly what's going into a study, making it get a result one time and not another. Right? So that is something to have an awareness of, I think even apologetically, to say, well, people are like, well, why don't you believe the science on this or that or whatever? It's like, well, okay, but what do you think the science actually entails? It may not be saying exactly as boldly and as simply as what people think it is. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I just learned about that this week. But it brings a problem for empiricism, because if all truth is known through observation, but you can't get to the same results sometimes when you apply the same methods as far as you can tell, that creates a problem for saying that you have knowledge at the end of that situation. Now, if we're in a total random chance universe, then you would get random results no matter what you did, no matter how much you tried to control things, because if it's random, if it's chance, if it just happens based on those things, and that's the only determining and controlling variable, then you couldn't do science at all. There would be no place for science if the world is not as the Bible describes it, with God as the creator and ruler of the world who maintains that stability. But anyway, we'll go back to talking about Aristotle and kind of how he developed his philosophy. Aristotle also becomes a philosopher in Greece to the son of Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great. He becomes his tutor. Alexander the Great has Aristotle for his personal teacher, and obviously doesn't become much of a philosopher, but becomes a conqueror, and is predicted in Scripture in several places, or talked about in Scripture in several places. Talks about, and I put there some references, but it's interesting that as Alexander the Great arises and kind of expands the Greek Empire, and the Bible talks about the ending of his empire and it being split into four and all this stuff in the book of Daniel, over 100 years before it takes place. So all these things are moving along on God's timeline as well. But Aristotle is kind of in this unique position to be kind of a court or aristocratic teacher to these rulers like Philip of Macedon, to his son Alexander. And so Aristotle took it upon himself to develop a theory of knowledge that dealt with reality, of sense perception, so what we experience with our senses, and the changing nature of the world, acknowledging but also he wanted to continue to acknowledge that there was truth, there was ethics. So he had a problem that Plato dealt with, which was the problem of change. If there's a changing world, and Plato says, okay, there's this ideal world of forms, that everything in this world is a shadow of the real, true reality of the world of forms, and the ultimate good thing is the good, capital G, that's the ultimate form, and that's unchanging, then why do things in the world change? And how can you apply unchanging principles to a changing world was Plato's problem, and he really wasn't able to account for that or account for change in general. And if something changes here, does that mean the eternal form of it has changed? That was one of the issues that Aristotle has with Plato's form. So he says, look, he gets frustrated and says, look, the rationalism ends up just speculating and sitting around thinking about things and trying to come up with a consistent philosophy without ever proving it, without ever really demonstrating anything to be true. And so Aristotle takes it upon himself to try to take into account reason, ethics, truth, but also sense perception, that we observe the world. And so he figured out, like, if human reason cannot explain change in the world, he said that maybe it's not an adequate tool for getting knowledge. And so Aristotle's epistemology, which means his theory of knowledge, involved two main presuppositions. So every worldview has presuppositions. So this is where we come to our first blanks here. Every worldview has presuppositions. Aristotle's epistemology involved two main presuppositions that must be intuitively assumed in order to know anything. So basically you have to assume these in your head before anything else. He assumed the principles of logic, and for him that's going to be something that we'll talk about in a few minutes here, and then also sense experience. So the first principles of logic, that would be things like the Law of Non-Contradiction, or one of the first rules of logic is the law of identity, that the chair is not the set of notes, that you tell them apart by giving them an identity in something. So that's a logical construct. And then the substance presented by sense experience, that this is the way that we are to know the world, to know truth, and to know ethics. But here's an interesting thing, just ahead of time. How do you get to ethics, how you should live, based on logic or sense experience? Now, logic will just give you tools of truth to recognize contradictions, mistakes, things like that, issues in thinking, and it is what we assume all the time based on how the world works and things like that. They're law-like, abstract, unchanging functions of the world. That's logic. Okay, but that doesn't tell you how you should live. Logic has to have stuff put into it. You have to have premises and things. Also, sense experience. Can you get to, I should live this way based on the information that we take into our senses? Aristotle's going to say yes, but we'll see if what he offers is sufficient to really say you should live this way and not live that way based on the senses. In your notes there, you have a picture of, and it's probably not, the one I printed out is not great, but you may be able to see it if you look at the two center figures in that picture. They are Aristotle and Plato. Okay, this is the School of Athens by Raphael, and he painted this during the time of the Renaissance, and so this is in the Vatican. Okay, so Plato is, and the way the way Raphael painted Aristotle and Plato probably indicates the differences of their philosophy. Plato, and you could look this up on Google, it will be the first thing that comes up if you Google the School of Athens. But Plato is seen standing and he's pointing upward. And he's pointing upward with one finger, with his index finger. And is so it represents his idea that the reality is above the world. It's outside of the world, it's independent, and all reality is fundamentally one. Aristotle is pointing horizontally and with an open hand, which probably indicates that his worldview is more horizontal. It's more that to understand the transcendent nature of reality is within this world. It's within the physical world that available to sense experience, and it's in the diversity, not just the one, but in the many that we experience, all the specific instances and the particulars and all the little bits of data we put together in its context, and that gives us the knowledge of a general theory of reality. So they have those two kind of opposing worldviews. Now, with some speculation, we have to use a little imagination here, but if Plato and Aristotle were going to school, Plato's favorite subject probably would have been mathematics, because it's a theory, it's a system where you can sit and think about things. There's formulas and things that you put it together, and you figure it out that way by using principles and rules and things like that of thought. Aristotle's favorite subject probably would have been something like biology, where you are interacting with the physical world and making observations and seeing what is general between certain things, where things are the same and where they're different, developing categories. So this is where you say, okay, well, how is a frog different than a duck? Well, they're both animals, they both have biological life, they have that in common. However, frogs have these specific features, ducks have these specific features, and that's what makes them distinguishable. So that's probably what their kind of bent would be, is Plato would be more toward math and caring about the thinking and the consistency in his worldview and his thought, where Aristotle's like, let's go out and see and observe, and the more that data we take in, the more we can put together a general and universal picture of the world in context. And people probably have a kind of preference to one toward the other. And both of these, again, are valuable in their place as tools, but just not as ultimate authorities. So Aristotle, here's another set of blanks here. Aristotle insisted on the basic reliability of, and we talked about this already, but of the senses. So he assumed, and we do too, that the senses basically communicate truth to us, and their essential role in gaining knowledge. Which means that Aristotle can be broadly classified as an empiricist. Because what's his presupposition? What's his standard for truth? What's his ultimate authority? He assumes that the senses are basically reliable, and that through observing those things, we can gain knowledge. Now, those are two pretty big assumptions. I believe that to be true in a sense. However, we also know that our senses can be misled. And just because you have an experience with something, even observing it a lot, that doesn't, I don't think, automatically communicate or equal to knowledge. But Aristotle says in his book on the soul, which is kind of interesting that he writes a book on the soul, because the soul is not something that is open to sense experience. It's not something that you see. It's It's not something that you can weigh or things like that, although people have tried to do studies where they took somebody's body and weighed it, and then they weighed it again right after they died, and they're like, it's a little bit lighter, their soul must have gone out, or something like that, which is, I don't think that there's much to that, but anyway, that's because I don't think the soul is a physical thing like that. But anyway, he says, there is no sixth sense in addition to the five enumerated: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch may be established by the following considerations. So he even goes through and proves, okay, here's why seeing, hearing, smell, taste, and touch are valid and provable and are something that we can experience in this world. So he's actually very careful. He even has a section where he goes through and talks about, here's why what we see is basically reliable. Here's why what we hear is basically reliable. So he's pretty thorough in a lot of senses, so we can appreciate that. And he also believed that general knowledge could be established inductively, meaning you go out and you experience things over and over and over again, gathering data through sense perception. He goes on in that same writing, he says, for the perception of special objects of sense is always free from error. Now think of that for a second. He's saying that whenever we perceive something, it can never be incorrect. And now what he's saying there is we can have an incorrect interpretation of what we're seeing, but an impression on our senses, like we're seeing each other right now, that is free from error. Now, I may interpret it incorrectly. I may imagine or think wrongly about what I am seeing, but that I am seeing cannot be incorrect. And so he says, which I think has some problems with it, that it can't be free from, that perception can't be free from error. And he says, and is found in all animals, while it is possible to think falsely as well as truly, and thought is found only where there is discourse of reason as well as sensibility. So he's saying he distinguishes humans from animals because we have reason and we can talk about it. We can have discourse of reason and sensibility. So Aristotle builds this idea that we are rational animals, that we think and that we can reason about what we see and perceive. Animals can see and perceive and experience things through their senses too, but they don't reason and think and imagine about it. And so he presupposes that basic reliability of sense perception, claiming that impressions on the senses cannot be incorrect. So this superseded thinking and reasoning because he says the ultimate reality has to be sense experience, because he says thinking and reasoning can be wrong. When you experience something, it's happening. It's not wrong necessarily. It's free from error. But he says, but when you start to think about it or imagine, he says that can be incorrect. And so the interpretation of what you're seeing can be wrong. So he says that, so since that can be wrong, I want to get back to the basic, what cannot commit error, which is what we experience. However, I'd say even there that runs into some problems. Because if you assume that whatever we experience through our senses is free from error, I think you run into some problems of that, giving a value judgment to something that is just experienced through the senses and say, well, it's true or it's false, doesn't really make a lot of sense. But anyway, he goes on and says, thinking is different from perceiving. Okay, so I can sit here and think about Hawaii, but that's different from me seeing the sand or the islands or something like that, and is held to be in part imagination and in part judgment. So he says that's what thinking is. It's part imagining and part judging what you're thinking about. He says, again, sensations are always true. Imaginations are for the most part false. So he would say, look, I can think about Hawaii and imagine it, but he says, unless I go and sense it, it's not true. My imagination is probably mostly false, but sensations are always true. But the thing is, I can't sense all of Hawaii. So, I mean, can I ever say that even that would run into some issues in empiricism, saying that I've experienced Hawaii because I've been there? Well, I haven't experienced all there is to experience of it. So have I ever truly experienced Hawaii as a whole, right? And would that even be possible? That's one of the issues of empiricism at its heart, is that you can't ever fully experience everything there is to experience about something and to define it as this thing and to say that you truly know it in its context, because it's just these pieces of data in the world. It's not anything that you can really put into a general framework. And so he also taught that all knowledge must ultimately come through some type of sense experience. He says, since according to common agreement there is nothing outside and separate in existence from spatial magnitude. So that's a big presupposition. He's saying it's common agreement that there's nothing outside of the physical spatial world, the world that's extended in space. Well, even remember the name of his book is On the Soul, which is not something that he has observed or anything. So he's saying there's not without going totally into just materialism, which is just that the physical is all that there is, he's basically saying that a common agreement is all that we know is the spatial world, the world that we live in. He says the objects of thought are sensible forms. So he has to kind of save himself here, because thinking itself, even what he's thinking about and writing, thinking is not a physical thing either. Logic is not a physical thing either. So he's just said his worldview is horizontal. His worldview is about what is happening, and let's observe and the physical world through sense experience. All truth comes through sense experience. But then he realizes, and there's nothing outside of that. But then he realizes, wait a second. If I say that's true, how do I account for logic and thinking and any type of principles like that? Because those aren't physical things that are found and observed in the world. So the empiricist, like Aristotle, cannot account for logic and thinking. So he says, okay, he's going to try to save himself and say, actually, logic and thinking are senses. They're sensible. They're things that you sense in the world. He says the objects of thought are sensible forms. So when I think about Hawaii, I'm thinking about it like seeing it in my mind's eye. He says both abstract objects and all the states and affections are of sensible things. Now this is his important point. Hence, number one, no one can learn or understand anything in the absence of sense. Meaning, unless you feel it, taste it, touch it, see it, hear it, you can't learn anything. But even that statement would undermine itself, because even that statement is a truth claim proposition that cannot be observed through the senses, except that I'm reading it here off the page, so I'm sensing it, and you guys are hearing it. But you're not. It's not something in the physical world that can be observed. And he says, and when the mind is actively aware of anything, it is necessarily aware of it along with an image. So think of like an elephant. You think of the image of an elephant. It says, for images are like sensuous objects or contents, except that they contain no matter. So he's trying to save himself and say, even when we think, every time we think of images of sense experience. So, which is kind of true. I mean, like I said, if you think of an elephant, you probably have a picture in your mind of something, and so do I. But he believed that even when we're not actively perceiving, our thinking remains dependent on sensory images. So, how does he kind of account here for science? He talks about, we think we have scientific knowledge if we have reasoned from true and primary premises. So he says he's going to attack rationalism. He says, look, it's been said before, science you can get to by just thinking carefully about these things and figuring it out. But, he says, but that is not so. He says the conclusion must be homogeneous with the basic facts of science, meaning you actually have to go out there and observe and do the field work and figure some stuff out. So it's kind of true. What he's denying here are what are called innate ideas. He's denying what's called innate human knowledge. Innate ideas are something that's kind of built into us as humans, or it's automatic internal knowledge of scientific demonstration. So what he's saying is that any premise or hypothesis needs to be tested and verified empirically. And in scientific study, that's fine. That's true as a tool. But if you try to make that the ultimate standard of a worldview, it won't work. And so he said that. So he said, even with that, though, being the case, you can go out and observe all you want, but you still have to have an idea about what you're observing. You still have to have a theory of how you categorize things, of how you put things together. So even though Aristotle makes a point that you can gain understanding and knowledge by studying things in the world through our senses and observing them, the problem with that is how do you think about what you're observing? And how do you make sense of it? How do you categorize it? Because even there, you still have to have presuppositions about how you think about the data and approach and interpret the data. So that's why even in empirical study, you have to create what's called like a research design. You have to say, this is how I'm going to count what I'm seeing. This is how I'm going to find the data. This is how I'm going to put it together. This is how I'm thinking about it before I get into it. You basically have to state your presuppositions and your ideas up front, because even by observing the process, you may change the process in what you're doing. And so there still needs to be an underlying theory of analysis, things that you take with you, even if you go do empirical science. And so he comes to this conclusion. I think posted this this morning on the Crown Valley Facebook page with the title. It's Aristotle's kind of summation of his thought. It says, we conclude that these states of knowledge are neither innate in a determinate form, meaning they don't come from inside us, they're not built in, nor developed from higher states of knowledge, Plato's forms and reason working down. He says, but from sense perception. So that's his presupposition, is that truth is not built into us, and it's not from an outside independent source from above, coming down to us like Plato's forms and world of the ideal, but it is through sense perception. And he makes the point that there's all kinds of things that we observe in the world that are particulars, that are specific things and specific pieces of data and information. But he says as we observe those, what we'll do is we put them together, we observe what is the same and what is different, and that will lead us to a general theory of what it is, of a universal. That will lead us to, okay, now we can categorize by understanding something in its context. But the problem with that is nothing can really be understood in its full context exhaustively. So think of like in a science textbook or something like the food chain, where it has like these animals eat these animals and stuff like that. Aristotle would say you would kind of observe all that and put all that together, and you get down to, let's say, like there's this little fish, and it's eaten by this in order for this purpose and all these things. But you can never really totally understand the whole context around the importance of that little fish in the whole universe and the small place that plays, unless you know and experience everything to figure out, okay, this is why that little fish is important. This is what that little fish is for, what it does, what its context is. And so his problem is you would have to basically know everything to know anything in particular. which you would have to be omniscient and omnipresent. So for us, that's not a problem, that's what the Bible, we have revelation from God, who's the creator, and who is omniscient and omnipresent, and can make sense of the world in particular and in general. But for empiricists, they have to try to figure out, not only observe something in the particular, but try to observe all the connections with the things around it in a specific time and place, and figure out what is unique about it and how it fits into the general world overall. So Plato's theory was top down. Let's start with the ideal world and work into this world and try to derive truth from there. Aristotle's theory is bottom up. It starts from, let's observe the particular things and then try to get to a general idea about what is universal and what is true. So read another quote from him from his book called Posterior Analytics, which means like after you've analyzed. He says, "Thus it is clear that we must get to know the primary premises by induction." So he says we don't start ahead with presuppositions, which is kind of true, but it's not really possible to do that. He says, but what we're trying to get is induction. You're getting that by observing particular things over and over and over again in the world. He says, for the method by which even sense perception implants universals is inductive. Now, of the thinking states by which we grasp truths, some are unfailingly true, like logic. Others admit of error/opinion. For instance, and calculation. Now, this is where he talks about science. He says, whereas scientific knowing and intuition are always true. It's a pretty bold statement. He goes on and says, further, no other kind of thought except intuition is more accurate than scientific knowledge. So scientific knowledge, he says, it has to be the most true because it involves empiricism, because it involves observing things through the senses. He says, whereas primary premises are more knowable than demonstrations, and all scientific knowledge is discursive, meaning it builds on itself. And so here's some blanks here and some introduction to some terms. Aristotle believed that there were truths that were what are called, this Latin term is a priori. I'll explain what these mean. It's not really complicated. This is a Latin term. A priori means true by logic or definition without having to be proven by experience. Okay, so this is a problem potentially for Aristotle, because he's acknowledging now that there are truths that can be known without experience, because they're what are called analytically true. They're true by definition. I'll give you some examples of that in a second. But he believed that all other truths in the world were, and then this is another Latin expression common in logic or a philosophy, a posteriori. And that those are known by verification through experience. So
they're both experience.
This one a priori is true. Yes, they're both. They're both experience. Both blanks there. I guess I didn't notice that. Yes, both of the blanks are experience. This one is without experience. A priori is without experience. A posteriori is with or after experience. I remember first learning these in a philosophy class, but they're not actually that complicated. This one is pretty simple. It's something that's analytically true by definition. So, for example, a triangle has three sides. Why is that true? I don't have to prove it, because the definition of a triangle is something that has three sides. So, and I guess you could get more specific in math or something like that. It's kind of funny, I ask students sometimes when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson talks about self-evident truths, and I talk about, are there any truths that you guys can think of that are self-evident? And we have some fun times talking about those things. But one time a student said the world is round, and I said, no, it's not. No, that's not a self-evident truth. That's a truth. Now, I believe it, but it's a truth that is true by observation. It's not something. It's true after experience. It's not. The world is not round by definition. But I'll give you an example of an a priori truth. In my school of thought in economics that I teach an economics school of thought that is based on what's called human action. That's the first principle of it. And that area of thought, the first premise of economics in that school of thought is that humans act. And that is an a priori truth, because even if humans deny action, or even if they don't do anything, even inaction is a step of action. It's making a choice in action. So it's a priori true. It's even if people deny it, they affirm it to be true. You can probably see why I like that area of economics as well, because it also goes well with presuppositional apologetics, like that people deny the existence of God, but they also, in doing that, affirm it. So it's kind of similar. There's overlap there, but that's an a priori truth. It's not something I have to go out and observe that every human acts, and then from there we build premises and things like that about how people behave. But like a priori truths are things that you can observe. You don't have to observe that there's something like a square triangle is automatically a contradiction by the definitions of those words. So Aristotle acknowledges there are a priori truths, like things like logic, but he also acknowledges everything else is built through a posteriori, observing and bringing things into a general framework through experience and observation through the senses. So, and both of these have their place. They're not bad. They're just categories. But I remember I had a philosophy teacher try to argue that that God in Genesis 1, has only experiential knowledge. He doesn't have knowledge ahead of time of what would happen or what he would decree. So, because it says that he observed the world and called it good, and that God only knew the world was good after he observed it. And he really thought that was a smart, like that. Well, that was a really clever one. He got us there, but no, it's obviously. A lot of times you'll have teachers like that who really think they have something that they have observed, and after a while, I'm like, that wasn't that smart. It really wasn't. It wasn't that impressive of what he thought that he had. But anyway. And people do that on Facebook and stuff too, social media. They're like, I saw one the other day, there's some meme. I'm trying to remember what it said, but it was like, Christianity was just created at the Council of Nicaea to control this and this and this, to control the weak, blah, 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 blah. And it was just a statement, and it was just written on this meme. And somebody posted it on this apologetics page the group that I'm on, and I commented, they got us, pack it in, guys. Just because somebody said this, like, all right, well, all 2,000 years of Christianity, now the meme is the thing that brought us down, But there is something to be said through apologetics through memes too, but not that you should be arguing on social media, but that is where a lot of engagement is happening. So anyway, Aristotle claimed that if we wanted to know general or universal truths about the world or any area of study, it had to be through, and this is the next blank there, had to be through induction. I'll give you an example. But induction is not bad as a tool either. But there's like inductive reasoning and there's deductive. Deductive is that you kind of like eliminate until you get to a certain thing by kind of walking out what does not work until you get to what is true. Inductive is you try to observe instances, or you build from what is observed. So, for example, we do, or we should do, what's called inductive Bible study. We don't go in and say God is like this until the Bible tells us God said this, God did this, God is like this. And so that's an induction. So we do use this process. But induction is drawing an inference of a generalized conclusion through observation of many particular instances. Induction is drawing an inference of a generalized conclusion through the observation of many particular instances. Now, Sherlock Holmes likes deductive logic, but we have to use inductive reasoning all the time. That's what I called like the toothpaste experience. That why do we get up and squeeze toothpaste out of the tube? Well, because we've done it hundreds, thousands of times before every morning, and we expected it to operate the same way. Now, why did we expect it to operate the same way? Because it has before in the past. Okay, that can work. If we assume one very important thing, and that's that the present is going to be like the past, and that the future, which nobody has experienced, is going to be like the past and the present. And so, for example, scientifically, you cannot prove empirically that the sun is going to come up tomorrow, because you can't use the past or the present for something that has not happened yet, observing something that none of us have experienced, the future. So we have to assume inductively that that is going to be the case. But if you assume that, that creates a huge problem for empiricism, because it's assuming something that has not been experienced and cannot be experienced. But we can't live without it. So we do inductive reasoning all the time. And we know the world is maintained by God and ruled by God, so God has said that there's going to be an orderliness in creation, and that the world system will continue to operate in a certain way. And so we can expect that the future will consistently continue to be like the past in general ways. Now, there are exceptions to that, but we can expect that because we believe the Bible's true. The Bible's worldview explains that to us. But other worldviews cannot account for that, especially empiricism. But here's like an example of induction. It's like the claim or hypothesis. If I said all swans are white, all swans are white. Now, how would we figure that out if what I'm saying is true? First, we'd have to define swan, and we'd have to define whiteness. But Plato would arrive at that conclusion or that hypothesis by speculating the reason and nature of swans, whether whiteness is a necessary part of swanness. Is whiteness something that has to be connected to a swan? Or is it not a swan unless it's white? So Plato would reason, okay, what would the ideal swan be? And kind of work down to particular swans and say, okay, the ideal swan may or may not be white, but these particular ones, they are or not. Aristotle, and this one would make a little bit more sense to us, Aristotle would test the claim by observing swans. Okay, this swan I saw is white, this swan I saw is white, this swan I saw is white, this swan is black. Okay, not all swans are white. But he would observe and see, okay, a lot of swans, and then see, is whiteness a necessary part of a swan in its form and its purpose? And so Aristotle started to kind of reason how we figure out what things should do is, what is their purpose? What are they for? How are they built? What is their form? So like a fish is built to swim. You know, it has scales, it can breathe underwater and all that stuff. And so it works in a certain way. It has an end, it has a goal or a purpose. Now he would try to get to, now human beings, we can reason, so we should act reasonably. And we should move toward being reasonable. So we'll move on here. So he gets into kind of the focus on the form of something, and then the matter. The matter is something that does not change. It's what everything is made up of in his worldview. But the form is how it appears and how it kind of works. And then he says that it ultimately gets to its goal, that there's a goal or a purpose for it. Or in the Greek, it's the word telos, meaning there's a purpose that it is ultimately supposed to be participating in. And so we'll move on here and talk about Aristotle and logic. So even though he was an empiricist, he believed that there was a role for reason and logic to interpret the data. And he's really credited, some people credit Aristotle with inventing logic, which is not really possible. Because logic is not something he invented. R.C. Sproul has said that Aristotle didn't invent logic any more than Christopher Columbus invented America. It was something he contributed in writing down principles in a unique way, but he did not invent, and he could not have invented it. It's a law-like principle of thought that exists in the world. It's changeless, it's eternal, it's how we identify and know everything else to be true. And we believe it's based off the nature and character of the God who is true. And so Aristotle does not invent that, but he does write down a lot of it. And he writes down things like the Law of Non-Contradiction, which is the first principle of logic. And the Law of Contradiction is that contradictions are always false, that there are mistakes in thinking that lead to the conclusion that a contradiction is necessarily false. So the statement of the Law of Non-Contradiction is A is like somebody making a claim or a proposition, that A cannot be A and non-A at the same time and in the same relationship. So, for example, I could be a father and I could be a son at the same time. But I cannot be my own father. I cannot be my own son. It's a contradiction in terms. God, some people are like, if you ask where did God come from, like a little kid, sometimes people share this on Facebook too, like that. And then the wise preacher said that God created himself. It's a contradiction. It's not true. God did not create himself. God could not create himself, because that would mean God would have to not exist and exist at the same time. The idea that the universe comes out of nothing. Well, what could come out of nothing if there's nothing there? If there's really nothing, nothing can come out of it. If there's if I start talking about a square triangle, defining a square and a triangle in a certain way is a logical contradiction. And so, for example, people talk about people think this is clever as well. Can God create a rock so big that he can't lift it? And the answer is no. It's just they've identified a logical contradiction, not something in the nature and character of God that is deficient. God doesn't lack power, but it's also the reason why they're able to acknowledge that is because they have the knowledge of God who's the standard of truth. So even they're saying, well, I just presented a logical contradiction. They haven't said anything about who God is or what God can or cannot do. My version of that is, can God microwave a burrito so hot that even he can't eat it? So I use that one sometimes as kind of bring the kind of humor to that. But anyway, these are what are called, so a rational worldview has to have what are called, I'll write this down as we finish up here. A rational worldview has what are called preconditions, meaning you have to have them ahead of time, of intelligibility. Preconditions of intelligibility. All that means is a worldview has to come in built with preconditions, built ahead of time, with something that can make sense of the world. Intelligibility means that we're speaking in human language. We're speaking in terms of logic and things like that. Those are things that, what type of worldview could account and make sense of something that makes that possible? A random chance universe could not, because there would be no point of contact, no standard of truth to make sense of those things. So these are conditions that have to be accepted as true before we can know anything about the universe. Those are presuppositions. So for example, in any worldview, they have to assume the laws of logic, the basic reliability of memory. That's an important one. So we assume that our memory, we basically remember things. So if that's not true, then worldviews fall apart. In a biblical worldview, these conditions make sense because God designed the world, and logic reflects God's thinking, his nature and characters, the God who cannot lie. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. And God's self-consistent nature as the sovereign and transcendent creator, who is the unchanging standard of truth and reality. So Aristotle and others can talk about the use of logic all day long. The problem is their worldview lacks the preconditions of intelligibility. They can't say why their worldview has logic or the validity of sense experience. Biblical Christianity can. And the reason why it can is because it has those preconditions of intelligibility, meaning things that you have ahead of time to make sense of anything else. And so, finish up here. There's one quote. One quote I wanted to read you guys. Talking about problems of empiricism. And it's by this is a book I recommend. It's short. It's by a really good apologist, and I think he's an astronomer. He has a PhD in astronomy, and he talks a lot about creation and stuff like that. And so he really good apologist. You can look him up online. His name is Jason Lisle. But he writes in this little book, The Ultimate Proof of Creation. He deals with some evolutionary arguments, but he really deals with a lot of this stuff that I'm talking about. And he put together a pretty good paragraph showing the problem of empiricism. And so he writes on page 38 of that book, he says, empiricists believe that all knowledge is acquired by observation. Observation is the ultimate standard by which truth claims are tested. It goes on and says, we must eventually ask the empiricist how he knows, quote, all knowledge is gained through observation. Clearly, this is not something the empiricist has observed, since knowledge cannot be seen. So then, how could anyone possibly know that empiricism itself is true if all things are indeed known by observation? If empiricism is proved some other way than through observation, then it refutes itself. Meaning, if you look outside of its standard, then empiricism is not true. He says, if empiricism's ultimate standard did happen to be true, that all truth is known through observation, the empiricist could never actually know that it is true, because you could never observe it. He could never prove it. And if a person's ultimate standard is uncertain, then all his other beliefs, which are based on that standard, are called into question. Empiricism destroys the possibility of actually knowing anything. And so it pretty much shows that empiricism is not a workable philosophy by its own standard. It does what's called, building up the ladder of the standard of how it gets to its conclusions, and then it throws the ladder away because it knows that it doesn't meet its own standards of truthfulness. So anyway, we have to end there for today, and we'll move on next week. But anyway, let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this time that you've given us to study other worldviews in light of your word and your world. And Lord, we pray that even though we use our senses, we pray that we'd use them in a way that is glorifying to you, that is an instrument for righteousness, and that we would understand those things in submission to what you have said to be true through the Scriptures. So Lord, we pray that this morning that we would go out and worship you in a way that is pleasing to you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.